Did you catch that? Let me replay it again for you in slow motion. You might be thinking, Maddie, that was just an overflick. Was it though? Look how the target was moving right before I flicked to it. I don't think that was an intentional overflick. In fact, I know it wasn't. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about exactly why this motion here works and how the technique surrounding it has been severely overlooked. Yes, I am finally making a video about evasive switching, the most underplayed and underpushed subcategory in aim training. Let's start this off fast and explain why this motion I just showed was not actually a misplay or a bad flick. The explanation for this specific case should be relatively obvious when you slow the VOD down. The bot that I was flicking to was the only other option available on my screen, besides the bot that I was actively tracking at this specific movement. The most critical aspect of this play is peripheral awareness. You might have heard me say this dozens of times already, especially if you watched my other videos about Snowy's dynamic technique or how to play passive, but I can't stress enough how important it is in evasive target switching. Evasive switching is the sibling category to dynamic clicking. A majority of the same principles and techniques apply to both. The only difference is that evasive scenarios have that added tracking component. Thus, taking a principle from speed target switching, it is okay to overflick in this case, because I will be dealing at least some damage to the target in the crossover. But that's not why I perform this specific motion in this way. And besides, on this scenario, time target switch control, which has a regen mechanic, the bots will regain their health if you are not smoothly tracking them. The reason why this worked was because I knew with full confidence that the bot was going to strafe to the right by the time that I reached it. But Maddie, why would you deliberately let yourself cross over the target in a regen scenario? Well, you're right. You shouldn't be overflicking at all in a perfect run. But there is practical value to being able to preempt your flick landing in the direction of the target's next strafe. When you execute this technique properly, you're essentially easing your way into synchronizing with the target's movement instead of needing to catch up with the strafe with a hasty trailing micro. This lingo should all sound very familiar to you. It's the same idea behind leading shots in linear dynamic clicking. See my video on this in the description if you want more details on how this side of things works. Basically, the motivation behind leading shots is to minimize the amount of motion or micros that you need to perform to kill each target. To do it properly, you use your peripheral vision to get a read on the target before you flick to it. When you flick, don't try to land directly on target, but instead, land just a little bit ahead of its movement, and time the click for when the bot reaches your crosshair. Doing this will make for a cleaner and easier kill. This is the same idea in evasive switching, but there are some nuances to get out of the way. The extended tracking component presents a unique problem with evasive switching as opposed to speed switching. This means that you cannot just ape your flicks and move at max speed, because doing so will involve a lot of landing shakiness, which wastes a lot of time when you transition into a tracking motion. But not flicking entirely also wastes time, especially in this context, because you would lose that timing window that you gave yourself from a peripheral read. If you think about it, this is just a question of tension management. Let's borrow two principles, one from recent developments in static clicking and one from control tracking. If we look at Xianlo, he has a very simple method to increase the fluidity of his movements and reduce the shakiness at the ends of his flicks. To perform an initial flick, he will have that same required burst of tension in the forearm at the start, but then he will release that tension or move it down to the wrist early before he reaches the target. Correcting the rest of the space between this smooth landing and the target just becomes his microcorrection. This allows him to avoid the potential time and accuracy loss of overflicking by consistently underflicking each time. The principle from control tracking is very related. When playing scenarios like Control Sphere or Wisphere, you practically never want to catch yourself performing fast adjustments or microflicks, because not only does it introduce the risk of a massive score loss in overflicking, but it also reduces your perception of the target's movement. Doing this properly requires far less reliance on tension in your forearm and not reacting drastically to when the target changes direction. It is for these reasons that in many of the more modern voltaic evasive switching scenarios, flicking is actually discouraged. But while low speed transitions suffice for the intermediate ranks, you will need to start flicking and landing accurately in order to push to higher echelons of this style. Once players start attempting these techniques, however, the most obvious and common point where they struggle is the transition between the end of the flick and the beginning of the tracking motion. Let us refer to this as the hook phase. This is where you must attach your crosshair swiftly to a moving target and follow it continuously. If you shake excessively or perform a jagged transition off of the target, this can be said as the hook failing to cleanly attach to the target, which means bad technique. What we're really talking about here is making sure that your forearm and your wrist and your fingertips do not remain rigid throughout this acquisition. Arm and wrist movement should not be mutually exclusive. Lots of players tend to have rigid hooks, which means that a lot of the time, players are performing all of their motions with just one muscle group. Players who use all arm aiming will easily be able to traverse the whole map and keep adequate flick speed, but they will overflick often and may have shaky micros. This is because they would be trying to control a movement that should instead be designated to the wrist or the fingertips, which are responsible for a smaller range of motion. Conversely, players who use all wrist will run into space management issues and sometimes slower than optimal flick speeds. Fixing breaks in continuity involves looking deeper than tension management. In the more diverse scenarios, you will need to flick to targets at varied distances. There is no way you can perform the same flick in the same way each time throughout the run. To inform how you should blend your muscle group usage and how much overall tension you should use, you need to use peripheral vision. This is why evasive is a sibling category to dynamic clicking. It can be argued that peripheral vision is even more important here, since misjudgments in flick speeds or landing positions are so easily punished. In dynamic clicking, you only need to land a single shot on the target to guarantee your points, but in evasive, you need to have a more extended read on the target's strafing. If we put this together, that is, proper tension management, muscle group blending, peripheral awareness, and the principle of intentionally leading our shots, we get an acquisition flick framework that works for basically any evasive target switching scenario with readable motion. KinTS is one of the best places to develop this framework since targets are so sparse, but also very easily readable. Notice how I intentionally flick into many of these targets' paths instead of directly to them. Taking that same idea from dynamic, many of these targets will not change direction again after changing once. When I flick into their path, I intentionally relax my muscles and move tension down into my wrists to support the following tracking motion. As you watch this VOD, try not to look at the target that I'm currently on, but instead, try to figure out which one I'm going to path to next and how I'm going to approach it. Doing this exercise gives you a good idea of my playstyle in this subcategory. And if you can understand how I'm choosing targets and navigating to them in my VOD, try to apply the same logic to your own VODs to see if you make similar decisions. One of the best scenarios to practice peripheral vision for application in evasive scenarios is Psalm TS. No, not any speed TS scenario, specifically Psalm TS. If you've not watched a Random Dead Dudes tutorial on how to get Astra on Psalm TS, you really should go watch it after this video, because this explains everything on how to play this map properly, and a ton of the technique knowledge presented in this video has its roots in this one tutorial. Psalm TS punishes poor flicking technique and poor target prioritization. The smoother your landings and transitions are in Psalm TS, the easier it will feel when transferring these movements into KinTS, with higher TTK and farther map traversal, and eventually into maps like Passu or Angle Switch, where the smoothness of your micros makes or breaks your score. Another way to improve your peripheral awareness directly is to use sparse, static, or dynamic clicking scenarios. These are usually scenarios with just two or maybe even a singular target. The idea is to eventually work your way up to being able to readily look ahead to your second target on your screen before you even kill the first. This helps you find the right balance in flick speed so as to not obscure your perception of the secondary target. Once you have this down, you can move on to simple evasive scenarios like the new stability category that features singular, predictable motions, where you can practice leading your flick landings. There's a lot of subtle moments in games where this technique applies really well. Obviously, those moments are the close-range fights in COD or Battlefield where there are a lot of targets and a lot of motion on your screen. The key to applying this to the real game is being able to identify the intentions of multiple targets on your screen. This basic prioritization step is what a lot of aim training players miss when trying to transfer their aim to their main game because it requires an understanding of the specific game systems and the goals of their opponents. For some games, it can be as simple as moving to cover. For others, the main priority might be taking an objective or a certain position. Once you identify the target's intention as a movement bias, you can then preempt your flick landing into the path of that movement. For games where movement is rather rigid, like with the movement abilities in Overwatch, finding and applying this technique is actually way easier than it sounds. Evasive switching is definitely one of the hardest, if not the hardest subcategory in aim training to get right. There's many variations and a lot being asked of you, which is why I place it right up there with dynamic clicking in terms of its inherent value as an aim training type. I hope you guys learned a lot from this video, and hopefully Evasive TS isn't going to be as scary and not as underplayed as it is at the time of the making of this video. Leave any questions in the comments or bring them over to my stream at twitch.tv/Matty_W, and as always, happy dot clicking.